briefly introduce Professor Kuniyoshi, who is quite famous member of the robotics and AI community. I took these slides, these few lines from his group website, and I think that it is the perfect summary. Is our research is about the theories and system of real-world intelligence, where I really stress the concept of real-world intelligence. His talk is very much of real world. It's very much in line with the discussion that we had before, because it actually addressed this problem of putting together learning and development. I welcome him, welcome Yasuo, and so I can give him the floor when he wants to start. So
okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So hello, I'm Yasuo Kuniyoshi from the University of Tokyo. So my lecture is titled "From Embodied Intelligence to Fetal Development." Okay. So I started research in intelligent robotics, and these are some of my very early work. At the top, it's titled "Learning by Watching." It's basically the robot watches human task and then visually recognize it online and then reproduce the task using the robot manipulator. So that's like imitation. And the second one is cooperation by observation. So one robot observes the other. You can see the other robot is carrying a box, and on the way there is another basket, which is an obstacle. So the observer robot thinks that the partner robot will hit the obstacle. So then the observer robot decides to go up and remove the obstacle. So this is a form of cooperation. Okay. Now, these are two, so imitation and cooperation are two really fundamental capability of human intelligence under the name of sociality. Then later I worked on some of the cognitive development modeling. At the top is work on how imitation capability can emerge from just observing self-hand motion, not knowing what kind of visual stimuli it will get if the robot sends some certain commands. So it doesn't know the correspondence between the motor commands and the visual motion. Then it learns about it, and then after learning, if somebody else comes up in front of the robot, waves the hand, then robot sort of automatically imitates it, because it sort of identifies that hand with the self hand which it has learned about before. So that's emergence of imitation. And the one lower is about body schema adaptation. And robot tool use, and it sort of models what's happening in monkey brain. Some neurons in the monkey parietal lobe codes the sort of hand region. But interesting thing is that once the monkey is trained and grabs the rake and tries to reach the far food, then that neuron that is representing the hand immediately extends to include the tool. So the robot sort of does the same thing inside, and exploiting that, the robot can sort of immediately learn to use new tools. Okay, so these are sort of bits and pieces, but then I came to think that probably these are not quite right, because in these works we define a task and all the conditions for the task. So, I knew that the system would work. So I thought that important thing is probably not these individual learning algorithms, but if you think about the learning system, what is important is that what it learns and how such data is generated and provided. And so I started to work on this to address the issue of continuous development. In this continuous development, what is happening is that the system starts off for minimal set of capabilities, and then it interact with the world, and that will generate new information for the system to learn, and then that the result of learning will change the behavior, and the behavior will further extract more complex information from the world. That promotes a further development of the cognitive system. So to address that kind of issue, we are following what we call a constructivist approach. The slide shows a diagram that what we do is we observe target humans and then come up with some hypotheses that we don't exactly mimic particular functionalities or aspects of behavior of a target. We think we shouldn't do that. We should not do that. Rather, we should come up with a hypothesis about generating principles that generates various behaviors and also the development. So this is a really complex process, development and behavior emergence. It's through body-environment interactions. So we have to start from the generating principles, embed into a realistic environment and body, and then see what emerges from that. So then we compare the result with a human, and then if something is wrong, then we feedback to the generating principles to modify it. So that's the basic approach. And as I think this is one of the main theme of these Shanghai lecture too, is that the idea of embodiment is really fundamental. We have to always think about not just the agent itself, but the interaction through the body and through the environment. And we have to always think about the whole thing. Okay? So along this line, I'm going to talk about 3 steps of our research. Okay? First, as I said, we start not from the results or current capabilities, but we start from the very beginning, which means we rip off all the cognitive functionalities, capabilities, and then reach to the very end, which means maybe we should start with brain-less body. Okay? So if you remove all the intelligence and brain, then what would body provide us? So first example I show is this robot. So I avoided video to avoid problems. So I show sequential photos. So what you can see is the robot is jumping on the chair, and it's a quite high performance. Okay, but interesting thing is that this robot. The motion of this robot is not computed at all. The commands are totally open loop, feed-forward commands in such a way that we first switch on all the actuators, actually send the air to all the actuators so that exert the force, and then while it's jumping, switch off the actuator to sort of fold the legs. Okay, but the result is that, as you can see on the left top graph, in this graph, the horizontal axis is time and the vertical axis is joint angle, and red line represents the hip joint, green line represents the knee joint, and the blue line represents the ankle joint. So you can see that first hip extends, and then the knee and the ankles. So this is a very nice natural motion, animal-like motion, but this is totally resulting from physical embodiment. Okay, and within the body we adopted sort of inspirations from animal body structure, particularly in the picture I show a biarticular muscle. So the middle air muscle is pulling the top link and the one below the link. So it sort of actuates two joints together. Okay, this is a very typical muscle configuration in animals. But before this work in robotics, this was really unusual. People typically design to put actuator on each joint independently. Of course, that's easier to control, but animal body is designed differently, and we showed that this contributes to the generation of this natural motion. So the body provides useful information to generate behavior. Another example is this. This is a biped robot, and it uses, again, air muscles configured in a human-like way. And another interesting thing is that it uses what's called blades at the foot. You can see the sort of curved plate, and that's a blade. That's a springy thing made from FRP. Actually, it is used by people who are missing the lower limb, and those who wants to sort of do athletic motions, running, and this robot adopts that. So exploiting the material property is there. So this robot shows a really dynamic running motion, exploiting the muscles and the blades. Another, again, interesting thing is that, again, we don't control precisely the motion. We provide only open loop commands, but it can run quite dynamically, jumping all the time. And then, of course, it doesn't run forever. It's like several steps, and then it falls over. But it's an interesting motion. Okay, so another example of how physical body contributes to forming the behavior without any intervention by computing and things like that. This is another example, a little more complex motion, including different elements. We asked the subject to do such a motion. So the human subject first lying flat up on the floor, and then the guy sort of swings up both legs and then swings down, and in one action stands up. It's a very dynamic action. So then we analyze the motion capture data, and then found a very interesting thing that on the top right graph, this is a graph of individual trajectory in the hip angle, knee angle space, different colors representing different trials. So immediately what you notice is that at certain point during the task, you see the trajectories scattered, many different trajectories, which means every time you do the task, you do different thing. On the other hand, at some point, like left top part of the trajectory, there is a convergence, right? So this is very interesting, and we did some analysis, and what we found is that in this motion, there are a few points of very critical states, as shown in the right bottom picture, that in the middle, the yellow disk shows the instant when the body is rotating on the hip, and then both feet hit the ground. Okay, at that instant is very critical. That graph diagram, the graph blue and some red graph at the bottom shows that the red part is actually the only successful states among all the blue region, which represent all possible posture at that particular instant. So this means very critical. You have to really control exactly the posture at this very instant. But on the other hand, a little bit before that time, the diagram shows a very large red region, which means you have a lot of margin in controlling your posture. So this is an interesting non-uniform structure emergent from body-environment interaction. And it's emerging from purely physics, but actually it has a meaning that what we call Knacks, so which means these critical states are actually really important in achieving this particular task. So this is an example that a pure embodiment can give rise to really meaningful information. Okay? So this is one, I show one example of this task executed by our humanoid robot. Okay? So next story is about, so I told you that the physical body can provide useful information for forming behavior and controlling behavior. But then, how can you sort of extract effectively such information from embodiment without putting unnecessary limitations or constraints? What I mean is there are lots of machine learning methods and motor learning methods. But typically what you do is you define state space, you define sort of primitive motor actions, motor primitives. As soon as you do that, you sort of already arbitrarily define the capability of the system, which may or may not correspond to the real embodiment. So what we do here is get rid of all these and come up with an alternative idea of extracting the natural possible motions from embodiment. And what we did, we introduced the idea of coupled chaotic system. So what we did is we adopted chaotic maps. So here, one example is a logistic map, like F alpha here, and connect the sensor signals to the input, and then connect the output to the individual actuators. Okay, So what happens here is that each chaotic signals are mixed together through the physical process of body. So each motor exerts force, and then there's physical interactions within the body and with the environment, and then that forms these sort of various patterns. There's some in the background. There's a work in complex system science about such a process of how, if you couple many chaotic maps, then you observe rich variety of cooperative patterns. So we sort of define the model of physical body. This example is disc-like body, and attached are 12 legs suspended by springs, and chaos signal drives exerts the torque, and also the external force can move the leg, and the displacement is detected by the sensor and fed back to the chaotic elements. So if we simulate the such system, then what happens is that actually initially each leg moves really randomly, but then in a few seconds the certain phase relationship emerge, and then also the body starts to swing regularly, and then the entire the insect-like structure sort of starts to travel in one direction. So locomotion emerges. Also, even the system exhibits adaptive functionality, like this robot hits the wall, then at that instant the leg movement are really disturbed and then gets random, but then in a few seconds new order emerges, and then it starts to travel in different direction, avoiding the wall. Okay? So what's happening here is that each element is totally independently controlled by a chaotic map. But because there's a sort of coupling through the embodiment, the global pattern emerges, self-organizes. So that represents the sort of natural capability of this given physical body. So we also tested the idea with a real robot like this. The figure shows the quadruped robot driven by air muscles. And we use a slightly different driving circuitry. Now we use neural oscillator instead of the logistic maps. But for us, it's the same thing. It's a nonlinear oscillator. And previous works show that if you couple many nonlinear operators, it doesn't matter the detail of each function, but the result will be exhibit the similar global behavior. So this is more biologically plausible circuitry. So there's a neural oscillator, and below that there's a spinal circuitry with alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron, which drives the muscles. And inside the muscle, there are sensory organs, spindle and tendon. Each measure the stretch of the muscle and also the tension on the muscle. And that sensor value is fed back through sensory neuron to the oscillator. But again, each muscle is driven independently. Only the coupling takes through the physical body. Result is that we see various behavior from this, and then locomotion, various types of locomotion emerges. This picture shows the movement along with the time. sometimes go forward and then go backward and go forward and change gaits and things like that. But this is interesting. Please remember that each muscle is totally independently controlled by neural oscillators, so there's no predefined motor patterns. But through interactions, such globally sort of meaningful behavior emerges. We can analyze what's happening in terms of information theoretic measures on this experiment. And I sort of don't go into details, but what it shows is we measure transfer entropy between the muscle sensors, sensor and motor data. And then what it shows is actually there are emergent coordination between different limbs or joints that reflects, for example, anti-phase control of left and right limbs or back and forth limbs and things like that. Again, there is no wiring between these different degrees of freedoms. This is a sort of emergent information flow that's sort of coupling these coordinated limbs. Okay. The picture shows just that a pattern of coordination spontaneously changes over time. Okay. So the third step is based on these considerations. So body embodiment provides very important information for a learning system, a developing system, and that coupled oscillator system can extract such natural information from the body. So these, we think, is the really initial fundamental principle of initial part of the development. Then we are interested in how it can work on human-like embodiment. So what we did is this. So this is what we are doing. On the left hand, what you see is an image from what is called 4D ultrasound imaging of a human fetus. Okay? This is now a very popular thing. If women get pregnant, go to a doctor, you can get a DVD containing such images. Is now becoming more and more common. Now, with this, you can see a 3D image real time. On the right-hand side, that's a simulation model of a fetus, human fetus. So it has not just body, but central nervous system model. And everything is coupled. The model behaves, generates motor actions within the simulated womb, and then based on the information acquired, the brain model self-organizes. We are starting to compare these data with collaboration with medical doctors. So very quickly, this is the model of our baby. It's a musculoskeletal simulation. So you define skeleton, and then you define muscles, and then you can compute with the dynamic simulation if the muscle contracts, and then what kind of movement is generated. Currently, we have about 200 muscles altogether, and then we adopt a quite accurate muscle model, and then size, mass, all the parameter is fit to the human fetus and the infants. Okay. And we define environments because the fetus is within the womb. We sort of simulate the uterine wall as a springy membrane, and also the fluid inside. So the baby, the fetus, moves its limb, body, and then it feels the resistance from the fluid. Okay. So we also connect the central nervous system model. Here I show a spinal model exactly the same as before. And this sort of implements the most primitive reflex, stretch reflex. And then we introduce here the neural oscillators, just like the same before. And then the learning central, cortical models connected to that primary somatosensory and motor areas implemented as self-organizing neural network. Okay? And we put left and right nervous system connected together with corpus callosum, just like human brain. And the entire thing learns as it generates motor behavior. And so it goes like, it starts with a sort of a random state, but driven by the oscillators, so emergent behavior reflecting the embodiment, and then that sort of generates the sensory motor patterns. This sensory data is learned by the self-organizing maps, and then the map sort of changes the motor output and further explore various patterns. So we do several experiments. For example, this shows self-organized cortical maps that represent, you can see leg, trunk, arm, leg, these correspond to the body parts, so it's called somatotopy. Okay? So maybe I don't have much time left. How long can I don't hear.
No, take your time. If I know it's already evening in Japan, so but if you need some more time, you can.
I try to be really compact. Okay. For several minutes maybe. So more experimental work. This diagram shows the previous work by pediatricians using the ultrasound, observing the development of motor behavior with a fetus, human fetus. And the important thing is that you see the red underlines on the labels on the left. It says first general movements, and then isolated arm movements, isolated leg movements, and hand-face contact. And if you look at the diagram, these different behaviors comes one after the other. There are sort of order of development. Okay. Now, our question is whether these characteristic order emerges in our model. Okay? And before testing that, we introduced an interesting conditions because we think the sensory motor experience is really important. We try to sort of change, deliberately, artificially modify the experiment to see the difference. So here what it shows is a tactile sensor distribution on the body. And you know that humans have high density of tactile sensation on the face or hand, but low density on the back or lower legs and things like that. This is on the left picture. But in the middle, the distribution is modified to be uniform. And then on the right side, this is a reversed density distribution. Okay, so we compare these conditions, and the result is that, interestingly, first, if you look at the right top graphs, bar graphs, what we saw is the natural developmental order emerges from this simulation. First, isolated arm movement emerges. The horizontal axis is time. and then later hand-face contact increases. Okay, we change the parameters of learning, but this order holds. Okay, so this is kind of important. So even though our simulation is a really very much simplified version compared to real human babies, but it captured the sort of global characteristics of human-like body in human-like, fetus-like environment, and then learn about sensory motor patterns, and that gives rise to this developmental order, which is observed with human fetus. Another thing is that at the left bottom, you see a graph, red and blue lines going up. This is the result of how isolated arm motion increases over time in our simulation. In the middle, the graph with dots, this is taken from a paper by De Vries. This is a result of observation of human fetal behavior. So on the same type of movement, isolated arm movements increase along with the time like this. So you can say qualitatively, our simulation actually matches with a human development. But the interesting thing is that if you change the tactile distribution into uniform one on the right, then no more the similarity is observed. The development sort of collapses. Graph goes up a little bit, but then goes down, and it doesn't develop. Okay, so this is an interesting thing. That's how sensory experiences, sensory motor experiences within the womb can affect the very early development. Of course, this is just a sort of showing one working hypothesis, using this setup. It doesn't necessarily mean that the same thing is happening in humans, but this is what we claim is that this is one possibility of which is underlying the early development. So what this work means that we can do condition manipulation experiment of early motor development, which is not possible with real humans. Okay, and we have done many other work recently. We showed that with the simulation that some features that are observed with preterm babies in terms of neural characteristic or early exposure to external environment and things like that, these all leads to abnormality on acquiring body maps. The reason why we are showing that, I will talk about later about the risks of preterms and other works. Okay, now this is actually related to a real-world issue of developmental disorders. So recently, it's becoming a serious problem that, as the graph shows, diagnosis of ASD, autistic spectrum disorders, is really rapidly increasing. But it is said that actually why such increase is not actually fully known. Half of the factor is unknown yet. And Nature points out that actually maybe so far research has really focused on finding genetic correlates, but that doesn't fully account for all the factors. So maybe we should look at the environmental factors again. And here we think that actually this sensory motor experience in very early development is one of the important factors. The reason we suspect is that there is many reports coming out that preterm babies have much higher risks compared to typical babies of risks of developmental disorders. But we don't know why. But one possibility is that such very early sensory motor experience is so important for development, so it has some consequences if you shorten the period. Okay, so this is a really important problem. So now we are forming a research collaboration with, so we are constructivist roboticists who started to work on various cognitive functionalities, but then really started to dig deeper, and then we are now investigating fetuses, fetal behaviors and development, human science, medical science, and also psychology. Also, we're investigating sociality, theory of mind, and things like that. But these days, also the very early development is one of the important focus. There's another line of people called Tojisha, who are people who have disorders themselves. Started to establish a systematic research methods based on their internal observations, but making it more making a theory out of these observations. So they also think that actually, for example, ASD, autism is typically thought as an impairment of social cognition. But what they say is maybe it's not everything. Maybe before you talk about sociality, their differences lies in how they sense the body state, internal body states and things like that. So again, here is a sensory motor issues, and embodiment issue becomes the really core of the issue. So we established a sort of new research area with collaboration with these, following the constructive approach, and we aiming at revealing the principles of development of from fetal period. And then based on that, we try to establish a systematic understanding of developmental disorders. And this will lead to comprehensive diagnostics, new way to diagnose the disorders, and also a system methodology and technology which is based on the really fundamental new understanding of disorders, and really good for these tojishas, those people who suffer from these various things the disorder causes. So I sort of skip the details. So these different groups are working on these each areas, providing Tojisha Kenkyu, providing internal observer-based hypothesis, as well as various investigation about assistive methods. And human sciences consists of medical doctors and psychologists, and provide continuous data from fetus to infants. And that we, the roboticists, build a model, and then compare the, of course, use the data provided by human sciences to build a model, and also to compare the results with the data to establish scientific validation. So starting from fetus, and then at the lower row, investigating caregiver-infant interactions, and also assistive technology. So that summarizes the entire project. Actually, it's a project started just last year for 5 years. And this is a really true transdisciplinary collaboration. So we have primary investigators leading each group. Yuki Nagai leads another robotics group, and Yoko Konishi is a medical doctor, pediatrician, and Masako Miowa is a psychologist, and Shiichiro Kumagaya is a Tojisha. Okay? And also we get advices from these prominent researchers on the right. Okay? So this is a really true transdisciplinary collaboration, and we're not just working on each field, but we continuously discuss and share the same hypotheses and methodologies and problems, so that we really come up with a joint understanding of the development and its disorders. And we also aim at, actually this is not exactly for this entire thing falls into classical scientific methodology, because this constructivist approach is not exactly you come up with a, you take a target, dissect into, reductionist way, and then compare with each experiments and confirm, and that's it. But we have to sort of repeatedly construct the system and see how it behaves, and then also combine with internal observation view of these Tojishas. This is a sort of different methodology, and we try to establish this as a new scientific paradigm. Finally, developmental disorders is really becoming a serious issue in the society, and we really aiming at contributing to that as a science for society. Okay, so that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, very interesting and stimulating as expected. I guess if there are some questions. Oh, maybe it's late. So it's not as late as in Japan, but also for the other ones it's starting to be late.
Yeah.
Late morning, late one. If there are not other questions, talking about, because you quoted a theory of mind. So from your point of view, which kind of theory of mind are more compatible with a constructivist and embodied approach? Because the theory of mind is a huge area. I think that you dig it much more than many other people on this.
First, how theory of mind gets formed, is established. Of course, there are many theories, but I think it's through the process of sort of identifying, assimilating self-body with someone else's body, and it's somewhat due to or related to mirror neurons, but so in that sense, by identifying, looking at the other's body as a similar thing as your body, gives a foundation of sort of simulating what's going on in the other's mind, right? So immediately this becomes the issue of related to the body, and then how that can be possible is actually, if you dig in that question, you have to address the issue of how body schema, body image is organized, and I think it's in this process of creating body schema that there's a key to understanding how we can easily assimilate self-body to someone else's body. But we don't know exactly what they are yet. But by doing research in our ways, sort of define a realistic human body model and let it experience the sensory motor data and how body representation emerges from that experiences. I believe that will give much insight about this issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I don't know if there are other questions. So I tell again to everybody that if you have questions that arise after the lectures, please forward us, that we will forward to the speakers, that I think will be happy to answer you. And so I thank again Yasuo for his maybe not as heroic. You are not as heroic as Josu, who gave the lecture in the middle of the night, but I mean you are giving it in late evening. So thank you so much for your.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
So we can finish for today.